The United States has just made one of the most significant economic miscalculations in recent history. Expecting to pressure Canada into compliance through aggressive trade restrictions, it instead ignited a backlash that could reshape the global economy. Canada's $155 billion counteroffensive isn't just causing harm to American businesses, it's exposing weaknesses in the US's economic stronghold. And this isn't merely a matter of policy, it directly affects you. The ripple effects of this economic conflict are already influencing prices, industries, and job markets. Will cars become unaffordable? Are trade alliances on the verge of a major shift? Most critically, can the United States recover before it's too late? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover could completely change your perspective. At first glance, it appeared to be a strategic effort to tighten border security and enforce stricter immigration policies. However, the real driving force behind these tariffs had little to do with security. It was a calculated economic move aimed at pressuring Canada and Mexico into submission. The U.S. administration believed that by exerting financial strain, Canada would have no choice but to concede to American demands at the negotiating table. But this approach severely misjudged one crucial factor: Canada's resilience. Officials assumed Canada would take the hit and eventually give in. But reality played out far differently. Canada refused to bow to economic pressure. Instead, its response sent shockwaves through the global economy, triggering a chain of events that no one had anticipated. Canada wasn't about to back down, and what happened next changed everything. Rather than a reactionary move, Canada's $155 billion counteroffensive was a precise and calculated strike. Trade wars are never one-sided, but Canada's response was different. It was strategic. In retaliation against the sweeping tariffs imposed by the United States, Canada targeted American exports with pinpoint accuracy. Unlike the broad, indiscriminate approach taken by Washington, which affected nearly every Canadian sector, Canada's retaliation was carefully designed to hit where it hurt the most. The first phase of this counterstrike, valued at $30 billion, was rolled out almost immediately, focusing on industries that were both economically significant and politically influential. By imposing tariffs on sectors with strong lobbying power, Canada sent an unmistakable message. It would not be bullied into submission. The U.S. had mistakenly assumed that Canada's reliance on trade would force it to yield. Instead, the tables turned rapidly. This was no longer just about economic retaliation. It was about making Washington feel the consequences where they mattered most. With billions of dollars at stake, industries from agriculture to technology found themselves under immense pressure. And this was only the beginning. One of the first industries to feel the impact was the U.S. automobile sector, which was already struggling due to global supply chain disruptions. Now it faced an immediate crisis. Major manufacturers like Ford, General Motors, and Tesla were suddenly caught in the crossfire, forced to reckon with the economic fallout of the trade war. The increased tariffs on American automobile exports meant Canadian consumers were now paying higher prices for U.S.-made vehicles, weakening demand in one of the industry's key markets. But the damage didn't stop there. The new tariffs also wreaked havoc on supply chains. Essential parts and raw materials sourced from Canada now came with higher costs, leaving manufacturers scrambling to adapt. Production delays became inevitable, forcing companies to either absorb the rising expenses or seek alternative suppliers. The once seamless North American auto industry was now tangled in economic turmoil, and for U.S. automakers, the road ahead looked increasingly uncertain. As automobile manufacturers struggled under mounting pressure, their stock values took a hit, sending shockwaves throughout the industry. From assembly lines to corporate offices, the consequences were unavoidable. What had initially seemed like a manageable trade dispute was now spiraling into a full-blown economic crisis. And the damage wasn't contained within the auto industry. It was spreading rapidly across multiple sectors. Washington had believed it could control the situation, but the trade war quickly spun out of its grasp. As tariffs took effect, their impact rippled through every corner of the economy. Manufacturing sectors, heavily reliant on Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto parts, suddenly found themselves facing severe shortages and production delays. Supply chains that once functioned seamlessly were now in disarray, forcing businesses to grapple with soaring costs. The question was no longer if prices would rise, but how much and how fast. But the damage extended far beyond manufacturing. In agriculture, Canadian tariffs on U.S. exports created an oversupply crisis, flooding the domestic market with beef, pork, grains, and dairy. Prices plummeted, leaving farmers struggling to stay afloat. For some, financial ruin loomed on the horizon. Meanwhile, businesses across various industries, facing shrinking profit margins, began cutting jobs. Fears of a looming recession grew stronger by the day. Consumers weren't spared from the fallout. As companies struggled to absorb rising costs, everyday goods, groceries, electronics, appliances became more expensive. The economy was being pulled in opposite directions. Inflation was driving up prices, while unemployment was climbing, creating an environment of financial instability. What had started as a policy aimed at national security had now evolved into a massive economic crisis, with real consequences for ordinary people. And this was just the beginning. The true shockwave was yet to come. If you thought this trade war only affected businesses, think again. The moment tariffs were enacted, the cost of nearly everything began to rise. This wasn't just a challenge for corporations. It was a direct hit on every American household. The cost of everyday essentials skyrocketed. Groceries became more expensive. Electronics saw price hikes, and even basic household goods were no longer as affordable. But how did it happen so quickly? Tariffs act as a tax on imported goods, forcing companies to pay extra just to bring products across the border. Rather than absorbing these costs, businesses passed them directly to consumers. Car prices surged, as manufacturers paid more for Canadian steel and aluminum, driving up the cost of new vehicles by thousands of dollars. Financing became even more difficult for buyers already struggling with inflation. Meanwhile, used car prices, which had previously soared due to supply chain disruptions, saw no relief. The impact didn't stop there. Grocery store shelves became another battleground for rising prices. American supermarkets heavily rely on Canadian food products like dairy, beef, and grain. When tariffs hit, retailers had two choices: absorb the increased costs or raise prices. Most chose the latter. Families were forced to stretch their budgets as milk, cheese, and eggs became more expensive. Meat prices followed, with beef and pork costs rising due to supply chain disruptions. Electronics and appliances weren't spared either. Many of the raw materials used in manufacturing consumer products originate from Canada. With tariffs in place, the cost of everything from smartphones to refrigerators climbed. Retailers issued warnings of price increases, and bargain hunters found themselves out of luck. The effects of the trade war were no longer confined to government negotiations. They were sitting on store shelves for everyone to see. But rising prices were only the beginning. What came next was even worse. Thousands of workers woke up to pink slips as factory closures and layoffs swept the nation. Already struggling with global supply chain disruptions, American manufacturers found themselves pushed to the brink by the trade war. The first wave of job cuts came from the automotive sector. Plants in Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky slashed their workforces as production costs soared beyond sustainable levels. Ford and General Motors were among the hardest hit, announcing immediate layoffs in an attempt to control their losses. But the damage wasn't contained to automakers. The ripple effect extended to parts suppliers, logistics companies, and assembly plants that depended on a steady flow of Canadian imports. Manufacturing jobs, once a pillar of economic stability, were vanishing. Skilled workers who had spent years in the industry were now scrambling to find new employment. Some took temporary jobs, while others were left with no choice but to rely on government assistance. For many, this wasn't just about losing a paycheck, it was the loss of a career. Industry leaders wasted no time lobbying Washington, pleading for the reversal of tariffs and warning that further job losses were inevitable. Business owners testified before lawmakers, detailing the severe supply chain disruptions. Yet, despite the growing pressure, the government stood firm, insisting the tariffs were necessary for economic security. But for those left unemployed, there was nothing secure about their future. As jobs disappeared, another crisis was already taking shape, one that few had seen coming. Canada wasn't finished yet. Now, Canada was ready to strike in a way the US never expected, by targeting tourism. Millions of Canadians had long been a vital part of America's tourism industry, flocking to destinations like Miami, Los Angeles, and New York for vacations, shopping, and business. Their spending injected billions into local economies each year. But when Canadian leaders called for a travel boycott, everything changed. Government officials urged citizens to rethink their travel plans, encouraging them to spend their money at home instead of supporting an economy that was actively hurting Canadian industries. Travel agencies reported a sharp decline in bookings, while airlines saw an unusual spike in cancellations for flights to American cities. At first, many dismissed the boycott's impact, believing it would be minimal. But within weeks, the numbers painted a different picture. Florida, a state heavily reliant on Canadian tourists, was one of the hardest hit. Canadians made up a significant portion of foreign visitors, contributing billions to the local economy. With fewer travelers arriving, hotels, restaurants, and theme parks began experiencing financial strain. Las Vegas casinos, a longtime favorite among Canadian visitors, reported dwindling attendance. The damage spread beyond major tourist destinations. Small businesses that depended on seasonal travelers struggled to stay afloat. This boycott wasn't just symbolic, it was a powerful financial weapon. Fewer Canadian visitors meant fewer hotel bookings, fewer restaurant meals, and less money spent in American stores. Business owners who had once supported strong trade policies now questioned whether the tariffs were worth the economic pain they were feeling. And the worst part? The fallout wasn't limited to tourism. Another critical industry was already suffering. American farmers, already burdened by various economic challenges, found themselves caught in the crossfire of the trade war.